Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on freedom, open inquiry in the Academy with our special guests, Helen Pluckrose and Ilana Redstone. Our program this evening is the fourth and final of a spring term series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of diversity, freedom, and community. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the spring series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, as always, very special thanks go to Institute staff, Assistant Director Eric Grell, Administrative Assistant Linda Carlson, and Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollerung, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Thanks finally to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation program supported by the Institute, directed by Professor Jason Marsh, and taught this term by Professor and Institute Postdoctoral Fellow Brendan Wessler, and students in courses on educational psychology and social science perspectives, taught by Professor Bob McClure of the Education Department at St. Olaf College. We are honored to have with us tonight our guests, Helen Pluckrose and Ilana Redstone. Helen Pluckrose is a writer and cultural commentator who identifies as a liberal secular humanist. She is the editor-in-chief of Ario Magazine, a broadly liberal humanist digital magazine that focuses on current affairs, politics, culture, science, and art. And she is the founder of Counterweight, an organization that helps individuals resist the imposition of critical social justice ideologies on their workplace, university, or children's school. She is also co-author with James Lindsay of the best-selling and provocative book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. A book that looks at the evolution of postmodern thought in scholarship and activism. Our second guest, Ilana Redstone, is a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the founder of Diverse Perspectives Consulting. She is a co-author with John Villaseñor of another engaging book on our subject tonight, Unassailable Ideas: How Unwritten Rules in Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. And she's the creator of the video series Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, a series which recognizes that we must have open and honest discussions about sensitive topics if we are to resolve our important social problems, and which offers tools and techniques to begin the tough conversations necessary for more open dialogue across divides. There are other things to say about our distinguished guests, but for now, Helen Pluckrose and Ilana Redstone, welcome. We are so pleased to have you both with us this evening.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
In the minds of many, the Academy, that is, the research university, the liberal arts college, the community college, all those institutions we associate with higher education, the Academy is the place especially where we ought to find open inquiry, unfettered discussion, untrammeled debate, and the free exchange of ideas in a serious communal search for knowledge and truth. The Academy is supposed to be the place where freedom of thought and freedom of speech reign. But our two guests tonight both say, in theory, yes, that's what the Academy ought to be, but in fact, it is not that so much these days. In their books and articles, they both argue that the contemporary Academy, at least in the United Kingdom and the United States, lacks full conditions of open inquiry, lacks the tolerance of competing ideas typically associated with academic freedom and the vision of the Academy as a marketplace of ideas in the search for truth. For Helen Pluckrose, the problem in the academy is the dominance of a particular system of ideas, what she calls the ideology of social justice, an ideology that is allegedly embodied in a number of intellectual movements and academic disciplines. For example, and these are her examples, post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, feminism and gender studies, disability and fat studies. This ideology of social justice is, in Pluckrose's account, intolerant of competing views and insists on closing off certain forms of investigation, speech, and debate that, in her view, ought to be allowed in our colleges and universities, given a commitment to academic freedom. The solution to the problem, Pluckrose contends, is the restoration in academic and scholarly settings of the philosophy that is, in her view, most compatible with free and open inquiry, a philosophy she labels liberalism without identity politics. For Ilana Redstone, the problem in the academy today is the dominance of three beliefs. One, the belief that, and I'm quoting now, any action that aims to undermine traditional frameworks or power structures is automatically deemed to be good. Two, the belief that discrimination is behind all unequal group outcomes. And three, belief in the primacy of identity along the lines of race, gender, identity, etc. End of quotation. These beliefs are presumably reinforced, supported, sanctioned by various academic institutional cultural practices and other restrictive social conditions connected with social media, online call-out culture, inhibiting tenure and publication processes, intimidating classroom atmospheres, and the like. The general consequence, in Redstone's view, is a censorious, punitive academic environment that substantially inhibits free inquiry in pursuit of knowledge and truth. To solve the problem, Redstone offers 8 practical recommendations, including the proposal, quote, to expand formal definitions of diversity, to include viewpoint diversity in academic settings, and the recommendation to recognize the role of humility in promoting productive discourse and a diverse range of perspectives, end of quotation. So let's begin by having each of our guests elaborate somewhat on their distinctive understandings of the problem in the academy and the solutions they both offer. So first, Helen Pluckrose, what is this social justice ideology that dominates the academy in your view, and what is this liberalism without identity politics that you offer as a solution?
Okay, so in cynical theories, we do look very, very specifically at ideas and the way ideas have evolved. Ilana, of course, as a sociologist, takes a different approach, but I think a very compatible one. But we were looking at a sets of ideas, and what we're seeing right now, the idea that language has so much power, it needs to be really carefully policed. The idea that knowledge is culturally constructed. These sort of range of ideas that are sort of underlying what has come to be known as social justice most commonly, or critical social justice. We wanted to look at where those ideas came from and how they have evolved. So we've looked at them we've gone back to about 1968. We think that the sudden sort of rapid change in intellectual thought that happened in the late 1960s is a very good place to start for looking at this. You can go back a lot further, of course. There's a whole range of previous philosophies, but the emergence of postmodern thought in the late 1960s has left us with a few core ideas which have evolved and which are underlying critical social justice and the censorious authoritarianism that we currently see. So in cynical theories, we argue that there are 2 principles. The knowledge principle, this is the belief that knowledge is socially constructed by any culture, and the political principle is that it's constructed in the service of power. So knowledge is not something that's objective, that we can discover, but it's something that we make as a society by the ways in which we decide what is true. So this was the postmodern approach, and it was a really kind of radical skepticism of ever being able to obtain objective knowledge. It followed on from really rapid social changes for the rights of women, for racial equality, LGBT equality, the fall of empire, the end of Jim Crow, the catastrophic disaster of Marxism in practice had left a lot of leftist academics quite despairing that anything could be true. So we saw from a lot of different disciplines, postmodern thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, Baudrillard, and particularly Michel Foucault, a lot of French postmodern thinkers emerge and speak about knowledge being a construct of power and being embedded in language. So we have these three concepts of power, knowledge, and language, which have become absolutely central to postmodern thought as it has evolved. In about the late 1980s, around 1990, then we saw a second wave of it, and this happened very much in America. So interestingly, while we in the West often refer to postmodernism as French thought, they refer to the current theories as American theories, and then we can argue about who started it. But when it moved to the US, what we saw was a more applied form of these ideas. So the idea that if knowledge really is constructed by discourses, by ways of talking about things, then there's a moral imperative and a form of activism in digging into deconstructing, as the original postmodernists did, the way that we talk about things, but also trying to rebuild. So the first postmodernists didn't really want to rebuild. They wanted to dismantle. They were fairly aimless. But when we got to this activist phase, which emerged in the US and the UK, but dominantly in the US, we see this aim to put these ideas into practice. So we called this stage applied postmodernism. And I think if we look at one particular form of it, it covers quite a lot of those themes. If we look at intersectionality, for example, this is defined by Kimberlé Crenshaw as contemporary politics linked to postmodern theory. Now, what she's speaking about there is the radical politics underlying Black radical thought at that time. She comes from the critical race theory school of thought. So she's talking about radical elements of the New Left, and she's talking about linking this to postmodern ideas of gender and race and everything as a cultural construct. But the theorists at this time said we can't just go as the original postmodernists did into radical skepticism where nothing is true at all, because we can't achieve anything. We have to accept that some things are true. So the things that they decided were true were these systems of power and privilege and these constructs. So Crenshaw said, while it is true that gender and race are cultural constructs, those constructs do have real power in the world, and power clusters around certain groups. So we see a return to objective truth in enough extent for there to be a form of activism. This happened around the same time in queer theory, where Judith Butler also spoke of intersections and these different identities and how they compound with these systems of power and privilege. And in post-colonial theory and later developments in disability studies, fact studies, we see this idea constantly that we need to look at the way language is being used, and we need to take it apart and we need to rearrange it, and we cannot accept anything as objectively true. So we looked at four main themes, which is the blurring of boundaries. So we humans, we see things in categories, and sometimes the limits of these categories need to be challenged, but generally we have to understand the world in categories. And they, the queer theorists particularly, were not keen on categories. So they wanted to dissolve the idea of men and women, gay and straight, masculine and feminine, and understand all of this as social constructs. So we have the power of language, as I've spoken about, this idea, which is very, very common to humans, of course, and underlies historical and current blasphemy and heresy laws. This idea that language can be a contaminant, it can be so dangerous that there is no justification in allowing wrong ideas to be spoken. They are literally very harmful to people. Then we have the cultural relativism, where if culture is what constructs knowledge, then one culture cannot criticize another because they're coming from different bases of knowledge. So we get what I found as a liberal feminist at this time, a very frustrating situation in which I could critique sort of modesty codes and restrictions on women and judgments of their bodies and how they presented themselves, as long as I did it within a Western culture. If I were to be critical of something like the hijab, which is a gender-specific modesty garment, that would not be acceptable within intersectional feminism, although it would within liberal feminism and radical feminism. These ideas have strengthened over 30 years. They've got very confident of themselves. And around 2010, they've solidified into a really sort of concrete ideology, which is now quite radical, which now really wants to enforce these ideas. The language is much clearer. It's much more assertive. It's speaking of objective truth, whereas the original postmodernists described themselves as having a skepticism towards grand narratives. They now have this grand narrative. And if we look, a very good example of this is Robin DiAngelo and her idea of white fragility. If you look at her writing and all the trainings and policies that are based on it, you see a language of absolute certainty. You know, it really is impossible for a white person to not be racist. You are socialized into believing certain things. You are not an individual. You do not have free will. You are a construct of various discourses, and the best you can do is try to recognize them and resist them as best you can. And this has got increasingly authoritarian. When we finished writing Cynical Theories, we thought and we predicted that the little bubblings up of this kind of theory in enclosed environments like Evergreen College or the knitting circle Ravelry, where we saw these ideologies take over and just destroy an institution, really creating sort of mob outrage and threats of violence and attempted suicides and all kinds of really horrific events. And we saw this as bubbling up in specific places, and we predicted that there would be at some point an attempted cultural revolution, and that this would happen in the US. And I think we saw this happen last summer with the coronavirus, with people feeling fear against an enemy that they couldn't fight, with the death of George Floyd. I think this is the thing that sparked a really big attempted cultural revolution, a proper riot, a proper protest, a sort of nationwide, rather than just in an enclosed environment such as a particular institution. So I think we're still in that situation now, although the riots have actually stopped. But it's affecting people in much more sort of personal ways. So we are getting calls constantly, well, emails, telling us of policies and training programs, people being required to affirm that they have certain beliefs about race, that they have certain beliefs about gender identity, which they do not in fact have. And we are at Counterweight, we're trying to help people push back at this. So that is where I think we are now. We're at the apex of what the last 50 years of the evolution of these ideas have been leading up to. So what we do now really matters.
Thank you, Helen. Now, Ilana Redstone, could you say a bit more about the 3 beliefs that you claim inhibit freedom of thought and speech in higher education? And could you say something more about the recommendations you offer to address the problem?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that. And I can also just talk sort of about the implications of this work more generally. The 3 beliefs, I mean, what we're arguing in that book is that so we're talking about that. The first one is that any action that's taken to undermine existing power structures is automatically deemed a good thing. And so one of the things we're careful to say in that book is that it's not a defense of existing power structures. It's a criticism of the sort of reflexive response that says this is automatically going to move us in the right direction. And it's that reflexive nature that we identify as problematic. The second is the belief that all differences in group outcomes are due entirely to discrimination, which forecloses any sort of fuller discussion about inequality. And that could be any type of inequality, whether it's education, health, wealth, income, and the problems that are associated with that belief. And then the third is in the primacy of identity, which is, in some ways more directly related to what Helen was talking about, although it's all there's a lot of overlap in all of it, which is identity along the lines that people usually think about it, sort of in terms of, at least in the US, what we consider these protected classes, race, gender, ethnicity, et cetera. So, and we're not saying that people don't conceptualize themselves this way. What we're criticizing in the book is the idea that everybody does and that everybody should. And so we argue that these 3 essentially prop up, or they are held in place in a way that has consequences for research, teaching, and sort of in the administrative pieces, including student-facing work. And then we talk about the role of social media in this. And in social media, we're talking about the sort of indirect and direct effects of social media, where direct effects are what you think of as, Twitter having a seat at the table in terms of what the consequences and penalties are for certain transgressions. And the indirect being more about the climate that it creates, that social media creates. So that's what we talk about. So that's sort of in the book, and specifically with the recommendations. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not going to go through all 8, but if I just pick out the 2 that you talked about, so expanding the definition of diversity to include viewpoint diversity. This is surprisingly controversial, and there's resistance to it. I mean, obviously, viewpoint diversity is not considered a protected class, and I'm not necessarily arguing that it should be. But it's more than just adding sort of another line item to a list of existing axes of diversity that we should be thinking about. When you fold in viewpoint diversity, you are reshuffling the deck. You're sort of reformulating how we think about all of these things. And that is, what John, my co-author, what John Villasenor and I argue in the book, that is exactly what needs to happen. And then the second one, which I think you raised, was humility. And so this is a really, everybody says, of course we value humility. And in some ways, it's very easy. Like, if you want me to admit that I am not the best cook, or I'm not the fastest runner, or whatever, or I can't draw, there's no problem with humility. But humility in this respect is about, what do we actually know? Right? So what do we know about the causes for problems that we think about, that we care about? What do we actually know? How do we know it? And what is that? And what does that look like? And so that's the very specific form of humility that we talk about in the book. And I'll just say more generally, my work certainly on campus, off campus as well, but we'll talk about the on-campus setting here, is I see the sort of outcome, the very practical outcomes of what this looks like with students. And I can give you 2 examples. One is, if I ask students, which I've done a number of times, if I'm teaching a 100 or usually a 100 level class, although it's probably true for a 200 level class as well, or frankly, any level. If I ask them and I say, what can you tell me about the benefits of a concept like white privilege? Like, what is it? I mean, these are theories. Like, what are they should help us understand the world. That's what a social science theory is supposed to do. And which that's separating it from fact. That's a whole separate piece. But, if I ask them a question like that and I say, what are the advantages of a concept like this? They are very good at giving me an answer. So things like, like just go with the white privilege example. Well, it helps us understand and recognize our unearned advantage. Okay. Or for example, it helps us understand and think about the ways that race and racism is still a barrier in people's lives today. Perfectly, as far as I'm concerned, reasonable answers. And then if I ask them and I say, well, why might somebody have either object to, or if that's too strong, have concerns about a concept like white privilege? I mean, they can't say anything. They have nothing. Like we're giving them nothing other than somebody who has a problem with this concept is coming from a place of racial animus and wants to deny the reality of racism in people's lives today. That's it. And you could say the same thing for colorblind racism. And so I see this over and over with students, and this is in a lot of my own work. This is separate from the book, but in a lot of my own work, again, on campus in the academic setting, is trying to say, well, hang on a second, like, how sure are you? I mean, we talk through examples if that's helpful, but how sure are you? And what does it mean if you're wrong? And what does it mean if you're not I'm not talking personally to a student, but just generally, what does it mean if we're wrong? What does it mean if we're wrong a lot? In terms of the assumptions that we make about people's motivations, and sort of, you can kind of chip away at the certainty that is embedded in the theories that Helen described. And so that's really sort of what I've been trying to do.
Thank you, Ilana. You're largely on the same page. You have different accentuations. I mean, I see that Helen seems to think that in a sort of central way, this is kind of a philosophical problem, and in some measure, which will be met by a kind of philosophical counterpoint, liberalism. And you, Ilana, are more focused on the issue of the institutional or social surrounds of some of these issues and what might be done in the way of modifying institutional frameworks in order to bring about a certain kind of change. So, but basically, you're on the same page, and you're both committed in some sense to liberalism, open inquiry, the free exchange of ideas. But if I could play devil's advocate for a moment. For proponents of social justice ideology, or holders of the three dominating beliefs identified by Ilana, liberalism is the problem, or at least one of the problems, because its formal affirmation of free and equal and open inquiry hides or obscures certain structural inequities that inhibit the real freedom of oppressed groups. And so, I'm reminded here as I'm thinking about this of Marx's distinction between abstract freedom and concrete freedom. We can talk all day about freedom in the abstract, but what's freedom on the ground? And doesn't freedom on the ground have something to do with the material circumstances impeding or enhancing the prospects of particular groups? So, what do you say then? Again, a kind of devil's advocate question. I mean, doesn't your insistence on liberalism beg the central question against social justice ideology? Or what would you say in response to someone who floated that as a criticism? Either one.
Well, I would say that they have quite a good point, because I am a liberal. I do believe that a liberal framework is necessary. Personally, I'm a left-wing liberal, but a lot of right-wing liberals also feel the same way. However, I recognise that there are valid criticisms of liberalism to be made. So conservatives will often criticise liberalism because it's always seeking progress. are liberals actually taking enough care to conserve good aspects of society? Marxists can point out that the liberal focus on the individual and the universal can actually neglect class structures and social economic factors. Social justice activists are not wrong to point out that we cannot address racism if we focus completely on the individual again. So they all have something to add. And I think this is where liberalism is powerful, because it does have that marketplace of ideas. It does have that self-corrective mechanism. We have to remember that when liberalism really became established as a philosophy, I'd argue myself it's really a characteristic, it's a personality trait and a general wish to gradually reform rather than, hold on to or have a revolution. We know that when liberalism first came in the time of John Stuart Mill, there was still colonialism. There's slavery and patriarchy and all kinds of inequalities still existed, but they have gradually been overcome. And we can continue to overcome them by being liberal and by listening to the relevant critiques of people who aren't liberal, people who might be conservative, who might be socialist, who might be critical social justice.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. One, I would just to go back a second, my interest, I don't know if it's so much about institutional change. I mean, that's part of it, but what really drives me in this space is how we talk and think and communicate about really complicated social problems, and that doing that in a way that promotes binary thinking, I think, is destructive, destructive. Right. So I was going to say, I was just thinking if that's too strong, it is not helpful at best, and destructive is perhaps more accurate. The philosophical piece, and then I'll come to your question. The philosophical piece, which is Helen's approach. You can't talk about this stuff without essentially sliding very quickly into philosophy. And I guess that what I found in where I engage is that with students, and although it's true outside of academia as well, making a philosophical argument is very abstract for most of them, who are not steeped in theory, who are not steeped in philosophy. So I agree with what Helen's saying. In my experience, I've had more success connecting with people when I come at it from a very practical place about, how do we think about this and what do we know? And could somebody, have concerns about this particular issue and not be racist? Is that possible? Right? These kinds of questions. And so it's not that I don't see the importance of the philosophical underpinnings. I think you get there very quickly. I think that it's not always an approach that resonates with students who haven't, and people outside of the academy as well, who haven't sort of done a deep dive into the philosophy or the theoretical underpinnings. With respect to your question about liberalism, I agree with what Helen said in terms of the weaknesses. Of course, there are weaknesses, and anyone should be prepared to sort of admit that and talk about them. I guess a couple of things. One is there's, the argument that you were channeling. There are a lot of assumptions that sort of sit under that argument, including how we think about where we are now in terms of progress, in terms of equality. Do you have a sort of, things have gotten better mentality, or do you have oh my God, the house is on fire mentality? And there are assumptions underneath those that I think often stay hidden, and that I think probably should be talked about. I think that the other piece that underpins that argument is this idea that the problems that we have, which sort of would come full circle, but the problems that we have today are because of these power dynamics. And of course, power matters. I'm not sitting here and suggesting that it doesn't, but it's reductive in the sense that it attributes everything to those dynamics in a way that is a little bit flattening, just in terms of the richness of the human experience. And I guess the last point that I would make with response to that, your devil's advocate question, is, I don't know, yes, let's talk about the criticisms. Let's talk about the legitimate critiques that somebody can make that I think Helen acknowledged as well. Is this approach better? Like, is the critical social justice approach? I mean, I know that's the term that Helen uses in her book. Is that better? Like, convince me that it's better, because to me it seems that the costs are extremely high in a way that go unrecognized. So I don't know that it's about perfection. It's about sort of thinking about those trade-offs and being clear and upfront and having that be part of the conversation. It's not about sort of, this is the magic solution and we'll solve everything.
Thank you. Another devil's advocate question, if I might. This now coming from, in some large sense, a perspective of realism, at least a self-styled realism. Somebody might say, look, the recommendations that you offer, let's assume that there is a problem as you've identified it, the recommendations that you offer in some measure seem to fly high above the political realities of academic life. So, to say that liberalism should be restored as a central feature of academic life, or that administrators shouldn't allow online mobs to dictate solutions to questions, who's going to disagree at a certain level? But it seems those sorts of proposals seem to abstract from some very difficult realities about the forces that drive institutions. And I've talked to a number of faculty here at St. Olaf College, but elsewhere, who feel like we are talking here about larger forces that are really kind of beyond the control of individual faculty or thinkers who are committed to liberalism as a philosophical point of view or as a set of protocols that might be in place. And that the best thing to do is just to sort of let things sort of unfold, as for the moment at any rate, unfold as they might, and then see what happens somewhere down the road, because now we're just spinning wheels in trying to do something about the forces that are being identified here. That there's something abstract about your proposals for turning things around. How would you respond to that kind of question? Maybe we can start with Ilana first on that.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Like, and with the recommendations that we make at the end of the book, and it's sort of easy for my co-author and I to just sit and be like, well, stand up to mobs and just do it. Like, it's, just snap your fingers and just do it. And of course, it's not that easy. And there are different forces at play, including people have their own careers in mind, right? And anybody with aspirations, anyone with ambitions has to sort of keep some of this in mind, even if they would like to see things done differently. And then there's the whole, of course, subset that, a lot of people who would like to see things done differently are not the people who make it into administrative positions in an institution of higher education anyway. In terms of what to do, I guess where I've landed on that, there are two things. One is in my own work, I guess where I've landed is on engagement with students, right? And so as much of that as I can. And again, I just want to say I do this work outside of the academic setting as well, but I'm talking specifically about on campus, is engaging with students. And one of the things that I've found in doing that is that there are different groups of students, and some of the students are, there's one subset of students that I would say are largely not going to be persuaded by anything I say, or that Helen would say probably. Like, they're not. They're sort of committed to the ideology, whether they would articulate it that way or not. They're sort of committed to it. There is another subset of students who says, when I'll start sort of talking about all of these different issues and all of these things in class, and they'll say, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in private emails, and sometimes just how they respond in class, is sort of, oh my God, thank God, like this makes sense. There's a little bit of that kind of response. And then there's this third subset of students who sort of never really thought about it. They just sort of, they've been, who knows, they're busy doing other things with their activities or whatever else is going on in their lives. And they're sort of open to it to a certain extent. And so I think that engaging with those latter two groups of students, I think, is really important. Now, I don't obviously interact. I'm not saying I'm not a magician, nor am I saying that I am interacting with every student on campus, but that's sort of where I landed. And I guess in terms of a broader scope, one of the things that I've been trying to do is essentially to build a center, a university-based center that would scale and amplify a lot of this work. And Helen and I have talked a little bit about this because I know we have overlapping interests in this area. And so that would expand outreach, would expand visibility, and would expand the scope of this work. I'm happy to say more about that, but that's sort of how I think about, well, the what can you actually do question.
Thank you. Helen?
Okay, well, I have a lot to say about what you should actually do question, because we've obviously just set up this very practical organisation with resources and a caseworker system, and we're addressing issues sort of one individual or one organisation at a time. But I think it's a mistake to think of this as an either-or situation. Before we can address an issue, we need to have the principles straight. A lot of the problem that people have had in arguing against critical social justice approaches and with challenging it in any way is that they don't really understand what it's about. So that is what cynical theory is for. It's for helping people get their heads around what it is they're actually fighting. After that, how you can go about addressing it depends on your situation. So we've got out certain resources, how to tell what kind of problem you're having, the different routes you can go down. Obviously, it varies. If you're in the US, there are different organizations we can refer you to. There are different laws depending on different states that we can refer you to. But if I were to speak of two cases, for example, that I'm dealing with right now, and you're asking me what do we practically do? So 75% of our clients are employees, a minority are academics, but I'll give one academic case and one non-academic case. So in our non-academic case, we have a really egregious case of somebody from the emergency services being penalised essentially for saying that he's not going to care about what race or gender identity somebody has when he's saving their lives. Now, this has just caused him ridiculous amounts of nonsense and threats of disciplinary action. It's endangered not only his job, his family's survival, and his mental health, but it's affected a whole sort of functioning of a vital emergency system. So we have connected him with trade unionists, with lawyers, with local politicians. We've helped him write letters. We've been through there. They have backed off. What we say works is persistent pressure, patient pressure. It took one of our members 8 months to get herself onto a diversity, equity and inclusion board and gradually persuade them to make the diversity training voluntary. But 8 months, but she got there. In an academic case, I have somebody, a black Muslim guy who has just come to a Western country, and his a diversity and inclusion statement wasn't considered adequate because he is a liberal humanist and he believes that the country he has come to is less oppressive than the one he's come from, and he's very happy to be where he is, and he wants to look at poverty. He hasn't experienced racism or Islamophobia, and that didn't go down very well at all. And because he's in a STEM field and he comes from a background which doesn't have this kind of culture, he didn't know what he'd done wrong, so he came to us, and I am essentially coaching him on what the problem with his views are going to be understood to be, and we're working out a way that he can manage to get this job by saying what he really believes as a liberal humanist, but by addressing the issues this particular Western country and this particular faculty is going to want him to address, which is going to be Indigenous issues, gender equality and trans rights. So a very practical, one person at a time way is how we are going about it. That really does produce change.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating work that both of you are doing. Good work and much appreciated. Thank you. Now here's a question from a faculty member at St. Olaf College who submitted the question in anticipation of the event. This is Chair of the Economics Department named Ashley Hodson. And here is the question. Given that it is not possible for faculty to cover all topics where viewpoints differ. How should faculty think about the right balance between controversial and safe topics for students to engage across disagreement? Controversial topics are likely to place everyone in the classroom on the same side of the table, arguing against a straw man, if only unintentionally. Safe topics may have a narrower range and less importance in the national discussion, but allow for more genuine conversation across real lines of disagreement. Which one is a more constructive way to practice engaging with viewpoint diversity?
I guess, okay, so the first question is just, what is the class about? I know she's in the economics department, so they're probably talking about inequality at some level. So I think that there's a way to do, the way that I sort of encourage people to do this is just by asking. It's very Socratic. It's just asking questions. And so not taking a position, I think one is not taking a position, which most instructors sort of intuitive, not all, but most instructors don't do that anyway. The other is just in terms of a strategy to touch on these controversial and sensitive topics is put some distance between the opinions and the people in the class. So rather than, John said this and, Mary, what do you think about whatever? Like, you don't want to pit people against each other. It makes it very uncomfortable for everybody, and people just aren't uncomfortable. So to the extent that you can put distance there, and you can do that by saying things like, well, how might somebody come to a different conclusion, on the topic of inequality or the causes or the solutions for inequality? I'm just focusing on that because you said she's an economist. And so how might somebody come to a different conclusion and so depersonalizing it, I think, can go a long way in terms of creating the space so that discussion can unfold. The third point, I'm going to make two more points. The third point is, you're not looking for, and presumably Ashley knows this, like, you're not looking for a solution. You don't want people to agree, and you're not looking for a solution. You are looking for people to be able to live with the disagreement on whatever topic it is that so those are three sort of broadly applicable, I think, suggestions. And then the fourth one that I would say is, in terms of her question specifically about the balance, so no one can make that decision. Every instructor in this case is going to have to make that decision for themselves. But what I would say is that if the logic behind staying on safe topics is that, okay, we're going to learn how to model this behavior, and then we're going to assume or hope or whatever that students are then going to be able to take what we've modeled on these, relatively safe topics, whether, climate change could be an example or something like that. And we're going to teach them, model what this looks like on a topic like that. And then we're going to assume that they're going to extrapolate and sort of take it from there and apply it to different settings. This doesn't work. It does not work. It would be nice if it did, but in my experience, it doesn't. And this is because everything that touches race, ethnicity, harm, identity, all of that stuff, it is just in a different bucket. It's in a completely different bucket. And so if that's your goal, is to sort of tackle that space, you can't get there by you could sort of start as an entree with the indirect stuff, but you're going to have to end up having these very direct conversations that touch the race and all of the sort of third rail radioactive stuff, because people in general, they don't make the connections on their own, because these things are held to, these really sensitive topics are held to an entirely different standard. So those would be my suggestions.
Thank you, Ilana. Helen?
Well, I was going to have very brief suggestions, because I don't have a doctorate and I don't have students, so I'm speaking, I suppose, as a postgraduate student. If I would say, when it comes to picking a balance, I think that balance tends to occur naturally in students' own interests a lot of the time. I know that in my postgraduate studies, I'm looking at late medieval society. A colleague who is studying agriculture is really going to be quite safe. They're not going to, tread on any sacred cows at all. They can do that. Now, for me, I wanted to look at how women negotiated patriarchal societies using a Christian narrative. I have to address gender. So it is very important to me that I have the freedom to do that in the way that I want to do that. I want to bring an acknowledgement of biology and psychological differences into my studies. So I think in this case, there isn't a safe way for me to do that. And in fact, that's why I didn't go on and get my doctorate and instead started writing essays and books, because there isn't a place for somebody who has non-critical social justice views of gender to look at women's issues in late medieval history. So as an economist, I would have very little to say on this. I know very little about economy, but I would, as a student, advise people to be guided by their students' interests. If you have a student who's interested in a dangerous topic, support that student. If you have ones that aren't, then they're probably, you don't have to worry about them quite so much.
Thank you, Helen. Here's a related question from a student in St. Olaf's Public Affairs Conversation, Levi Scott. This is a video question.
Hi, my name is Levi Scott. I'm a sophomore in the Public Affairs Conversation. My question stems from Dr. Redstone's article, The Danger of Unassailable Ideas, in which 3 beliefs that have essentially become facts in the world of academia are listed. What steps should be taken to reintroduce dissent in these areas of debate without immediately ending the conversation by alienating those that hold these beliefs? Thank you.
I am a strong advocate of not entering into a debate. I think that this is where things go off the rails. I mean, I don't think it'll get you where you want to be. I think where you want to be in this space is to get to the place where there's a recognition. Success in this space is getting recognition that there are multiple morally valid perspectives that can be brought to bear on these issues. And that relates directly to the 3 beliefs that we talk about in the book. And the way you get there is it's not with confrontation and it's not with aggression, it's with asking questions and sort of just thinking. And so, I can give you a concrete example. So if you say I've done this with students before, but to Levi's question, on a topic like race-based college admissions, right? And so again, this is keeping in mind the 3 points that I said in response to Ashley's question. You could say, why might somebody oppose, this, if you're facilitating a discussion, why might somebody oppose race-based college admissions? Well, and usually a response that you would get is, well, because they're racist and they resent the people who stand to benefit from such programs, and so there's some resentment and hostility there. And so you can imagine a list that you're keeping, and sort of that's number 1 on the list. Okay, write that down. Yes, because of racial animus, that would be one motivation. And then it's sort of a question of, well, is there any other reason? This works better when you're talking with more than one person, but is there any other reason why somebody might not be sure that this is the right way to go in terms of race-based college admissions? And usually people will come up with something else. Like, it's usually they don't sit there in silence. Usually there's some other reason. And so then it's a question of, well, okay, we've got these multiple things on our list, one of which is racism. How do we know which one is motivating this particular person? And of course, the answer is that in the absence of other information, you can't know. And so this is sort of what I was saying before. Then you're at a place where you're saying, well, what does it mean if we get it wrong? What if we assume it's racism and it's not? We've just said there are these other things on this list. And so what if we get it wrong? And what if we get it wrong a lot? And what does that mean? And so to Levi's question, again, what I'm saying is a little bit more applicable for a broad than a group than a one-on-one. But you could use a modified version of that where it's just asking questions about, well, how, you can go a lot deeper than that in terms of how we think about, again, all these issues of racism and inequality and again, everything that sort of is the topics of conversation in this space. But that's what I would say is it's very much try, again, even in Levi's, if you were having a one-on-one conversation, try and put some distance between you and the person you're talking to so it doesn't seem like a debate. Try it so you can make it, put 2 degrees of separation or whatever, you're talking in the abstract. and then through questions rather than a debate style, because that's where you're trying to end up again, is that there are multiple morally valid ways that somebody could think about a particular issue. And if you get there, that's where you want to be.
Thank you, Ilana. Helen?
I think this is probably the first time Ilana and I disagree, because I do see value in debate, and not in aggressive debate, but in bringing together different ideas. I for example, I love Cornel West, and I love the way he said, my friend and my fellow Christian, Glenn Lowry, before proceeding to dismantle absolutely every position that Glenn Lowry took. And I think trying to get to that kind of state, it may be a utopian idea, but getting to bringing these ideas together, how to do this, though, without immediately shutting things down, I don't think that's always as hard as people think it is. If you're approaching somebody who is a committed ideologue, you're going to have a problem. If whatever that ideology is, you can't approach a committed Christian with the suggestion that God might not exist and expect to find a compromise, for example. But if you're approaching somebody who is a committed social justice advocate, and they believe that anything you say is just evidence of your white fragility or your denial or your being socialized into these harmful discourses, this person isn't having a conversation. They're not subjecting their ideas to the marketplace of ideas. And I think we need to try to move towards an understanding that they're not participating. And so we have to kind of talk around them, because the vast majority of people are not committed to these ideas. They have absorbed some of them, they believe some of them, but as Ilana points out, they can see flaws in some of them. They're not quite there. They may see alternatives. So trying to find some of those alternatives, because we advise employees mostly, we will say begin, if you're in a code green situation, begin with questions. If you find yourself in a situation where there really is a definite problem and you have to sort of firmly address it, then you can still do so in a cooperative way. Assume the best intentions of the person you're talking to. So in our case, your employer may not know what is in the training program and the policies that they are actually advocating. So you can provide this information in a way that allows people to save face and to actually have a productive discussion that isn't a debate in which one person is going to win, but in which different ideas can be discussed and this not be seen as threatening.
On the assumption that some kind of debating is appropriate or useful in classroom context, what do you think about the idea of artificially assigning positions to the participants in the debate? That is, say, where they would be forced to or expected to defend positions that they don't hold. Because I've heard some people say that this is a very good idea, a good way of opening things up, but I've also heard some criticisms of this practice. Do either one of you have a view of the matter?
I think it's a very good idea, and I like the idea of steel manning. So I had to, for example, it was a compulsory module. I had to write a paper doing a postmodern reading of a certain literary text. And so I did so. I protected my intellectual integrity by having an introduction which essentially said, everything I say after this is complete nonsense and I don't believe it, but this is how it works. The theory, and then I did that, and the response I got to that was, well, it was wobbly at the first bit, but then it got really good. So try to steel man it if you can, and really try to make the best argument for the other side, and I do see value in that. I think it shouldn't be forced, though. I don't think, in the same way we might understand why it wouldn't be right to force a Muslim student to argue for Christ being the Son of God, you shouldn't compel any student to argue for something that they find morally offensive. I think you should encourage them to, or perhaps insist that they do pick a subject that they don't believe in and argue for it, but one that isn't going to make them affirm things that they don't believe to be true, even if they can make that disclaimer in the way I did.
Interesting. Ilana, did you
Yeah,
want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think it is a good exercise. I mean, I do think that again, this is the distance thing, I think can be helpful here. And it's not going to solve every issue, but it'll get a little bit at the example that Helen brought up, which is that, I'm not endorsing this argument. I mean, you could sort of, even that language, like, I'm not endorsing this argument, I'm channeling it, and sort of, what would somebody say who took this position? So that kind of language, I do think it's a helpful exercise, because I think it's a way to get away from these arguments that sometimes I'll hear that are extremely, it's sort of like, yes, it's sort of, again, it would be absolutely not qualify as steel manning, which is, I'm going to take the other side, but it's in a way that is, yes, I'm sort of technically taking the other side, but I'm doing it in a manner that's extremely dismissive. And so it gets away from that. The other thing that I would just say about my response to Levi's question is that, what I'm talking about, and maybe it differs a little bit from the cases, for instance, that Helen deals with in counterweight. I'm talking about when the stakes are low, right? I'm talking about, like, when, in terms of the climate, you want to be able to engage with somebody on these topics. You want to broaden the discussion, but the stakes are low in the sense that there's not, other than the quality of the culture, which is not nothing, but there's not something on the table in the sense of a policy or a curriculum or something like that. And so some of what I'm saying, when there is a decision that has to be made, some of it does have to be modified. But so what I'm saying was more a little bit, I mean, it's related, but it's more focused on, let's just elbow out a little space for some different perspectives.
Thank you. The criticism I sometimes hear of this business of assigning artificially positions in debates is that, in fact, one student said this in reaction to an assignment to me once. He says, we're training sophists who are not concerned about the truth of the matter, getting at the truth of the matter, but rather making the best argument in support of whatever position is being assigned. And didn't Socrates argue against that? And shouldn't we be concerned about truth and that sort of thing? But Helen, you're shaking your head thinking that that's a misconceived way of understanding this.
I think so, yes. I think you can use rhetoric in order to try to appear plausible, or you can actually engage with concepts with which you disagree and try to find something good in them genuinely. Now that is the thing that has value. If it's mere word games, then it doesn't have any value. We are just teaching people to make things up as they go along. But if it's engaging with concepts that are really strongly held and really trying to find value in them, even if it's really difficult, then that is a good exercise generally, and it expands beyond the specific conversation.
Okay, thank you. Helen, you mentioned in earlier conversation the example of the class in agriculture, or agriculture as a topic not generating debate, and quite in the same way that other contexts might. But there is this discussion these days about whether or not, for example, natural science, as it has been done, or mathematics, as it has been done, whether these are intrinsically, problematically racist approaches to the pursuit of knowledge. I mean, you hear that kind of thing now, and whether or not the natural sciences have to radically re-alter their approach to teaching and research, and similarly with respect to mathematics. I mean, why does anybody say this, number one? What is it that prompts someone to make that kind of observation? And secondly, what do you make of that kind of claim?
Sorry, this comes, I mean, having this idea that all ideas are equal, different ways of knowing. So this is the concept of research justice, the idea that science, reason, and evidence are better ways of knowing than, say, witchcraft, alchemy, and phrenology. This is this is known as research justice. It comes from the idea that Western dominant forces have decided what is true, and it isn't naturally so. I myself have tried to argue very strongly against this and was disinvited from a decolonized STEM symposium because apparently my argument that saying that STEM is for white men was actually a bit sexist and racist. That apparently endangered the safety of the other attendees. But that is what I make of this. I think this is reinscribing Orientalism. So Orientalism was that idea by Edward Said that the West constructed itself as rational, scientific and liberal by presenting the East as mystical, spiritual, exotic and primitive. And so there was a lot of truth in that. That was how the East was being written about. A liberal approach doesn't make this assumption. It assumes that science, reason, and liberalism are human traits and that everybody can use them. The social justice ideas, which seem to have taken us backwards, in which they're again ascribing scientific knowledge to straight white men and all other kinds of knowledge to women or people of colour, is Orientalism. It's not ethically justifiable, and I think it's quite easy to make that argument, particularly here in the UK. We are dependent on attracting doctors and engineers from India, Pakistan and Nigeria because we have a STEM deficit. You can wonder how such professionals will feel if they arrive and are then told by a research justice activist within cultural studies that STEM isn't actually for them, it's for white people.
Ilana, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think Helen's answer, in terms of where does this come from, it's, in addition to what Helen said, I think it comes from the sort of, a lot of this comes from very real concerns over, sort of a lack of representation in some of these fields, and sort of the causes of the lack of representation, and what is the ideal composition in terms, that if people, what is it? In other words, like, is representation? Do we know that we're there when you have 50% of men and 50% of women in every single major and every single occupation, including 50% of women sitting on, death row, right? Is that when we know that we've sort of done our deconstruction of gender norms? And so you get into, but I think a lot of this comes into this place of, or comes from these concerns about representation and sort of how to solve that problem. And I think that our conversation is sort of what I've been saying before, but I think our conversation is broken on these topics, and so we end up with, for example, the claims that you talked about. I think it's also made more complicated by the fact that, take it away from mathematics, but you talk about science more generally. In fact, I just, in a class yesterday, I was talking about this. A student asked about, sort of biology and biological arguments. He was talking about, it was a student who was reading The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, and sort of asking about these kinds of arguments. And one of the things that we talked about in the class was, look, science, and again here more broadly, has been used in ways that have been very sinister, right? And so that's just true. That's true on an international scale. That's certainly true in this country, in the United States. And so there's a fear, just talking about the sort of the biological side, there's a real concern about the way information will be used. And that is a fear that is grounded in things that have actually happened. Now, the problem is that the assertion that, that there's no there, that there's no truth to any of it, or that it's all, that it's all racist to its core, or whatever the argument is, that's not an engagement with, in terms of the truth seeking. That's not a way to sort of disarm that. This is why Steven Pinker says, I'm just going to quote his argument, which is basically that equality has to be a moral principle. So going back to your sort of the science is racist, the math is racist, it's all tangled up with these concerns about equity and representation and the sort of historical nature of the way information has been used. In addition, not instead of, but in addition to everything Helen said about the more historical and philosophical foundations of how we think about knowledge and epistemology and what we know. So I think it's complicated.
Yes, it is. You both talk quite a bit in your writings about the self-censoring that goes on in the in various academic institutional contexts. And a good bit of this self-censoring is motivated, it seems to me, by the concern to avoid, if at all possible, committing microaggressions. So I'm wondering, where do you think we are on the microaggressions debate or discussion, or is there a debate at this point? What do you make of the phenomenon of microaggression and the way in which the fact of microaggression has been appealed to in various contexts as a way of limiting conversations on campus, in the classroom, and so forth?
I have a lot of strong views on the concept of microaggressions. I think it's a misnomer to begin with, because one is either an aggressor or one isn't. Quite often, something that is considered a microaggression can be entirely innocent, or it can be insensitive. So I think if you're thinking in terms of things that can be said which can mount up and be hurtful, and this can happen. So if you are, I saw a wonderful video of a number of Black and South Asian origin Irish people saying how hurtful it was to be told over and over again as children that they didn't look Irish. So, I think saying something like that, calling it a microaggression and relating it to dominant systems of whiteness permeating all of society isn't very helpful, but saying perhaps be a bit more thoughtful here. How do you think a child who is perhaps one in their class who is, say, Black, would feel by being told that they don't look Irish, or they don't look as though they come from the country they consider themselves to come from? Be more thoughtful and considerate, and it's perfectly reasonable. And this is where Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff argue well, I think, for someone to say in a helpful way, I'd rather you didn't say things like that because it makes me feel like this, than to say, well, this is an aggression, a microaggression, and evidence of your white supremacy, which you've internalized. That's not very helpful. This comes down to thoughtfulness.
Thank you, Helen. Ilana?
No, it's interesting. I like the distinction that Helen made about sort of decoupling it from this broader worldview and sort of in the context of thoughtfulness. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, I don't have the same... I see her point about aggressors and non-aggressors. That makes sense. I guess the way I think about it more is that, there are comments that whether you call them microaggressions, Helen makes a good argument for why we shouldn't call them that. Whatever you call them, there are certain comments that most people will get behind, like the example that she gave, or another example of, another sort of cringe-inducing example would be something like, oh, you're smart. You're smarter than I expected. Well, okay. Well, what does that mean? That sounds like a backhanded compliment. So there are comments that I think people would most people would say, yeah, no, we shouldn't. We don't want to hear that. I don't want to say it. I don't want to hear it. I think it's a question of scope. When you define microaggressions based on whether or not somebody is offended, you end up with tripwires that proliferate and that are almost impossible to see. So I'll make 2 points. I'll make an example and then I'll make a final point. So the example is that, I talked to a group one time, and there was a subset of the group that was upset by the use of the word healthy. And so they felt that it was sort of exclusive in terms of different body types, and also that it was normative in terms of the judgments that were implied about diet and lifestyle. I don't think they were making it up. I think they were legitimately offended. And so the question was, well, what do you want to do about that? Right? Like, you call that a microaggression. What do you want to do about it? And this was actually at a company, not on campus. So what do you want to do about it? Do you want to tell people to stop using the word healthy? Most people sort of think, well, wait a minute, okay, that's going a little too far. And so you're always going to end up at this place where, if intent, and this is the last point, intent has to matter. This is very anti-Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, I get it. But intent, it simply has to matter. It can't be everything, but the whole concept of microaggressions says that it doesn't, that it's all impact. And you can't create any sort of sustainable culture like that. Or if you do, you at least need to be aware of the implications, which is that you are always going to be constrained by the most sensitive person in the room or in the community or whatever. And what does that mean? And there are going to be some serious consequences and sort of external implications from that. So that's, I guess, sort of the way I think about microaggressions more generally.
Ilana, in your book, you cite the work of Scott Lilienfeld of Emory University on microaggressions, and
passed away. Yes,
yes, he did, and that's a sad fact.
It is sad.
He argued in that piece, I think it came out in 2017, something like that, that he thought there was enough ambiguity about the phenomenon of microaggression that there ought to be a moratorium on any diversity training model that relied on it. Would either of you go so far as to say that?
I think if I remember I'm trying to remember part of what his argument was. I think, and I hope I'm not misstating it, but from what I remember from that work that he did on microaggressions, part of what he was saying was that you can't, there's all this, the whole argument about microaggressions is that they cause harm. They cause this psychological harm. But what he was saying was that, you just can't rule out with any degree of certainty at all that it's all self-selection, right? That it's all just the people who are sensitive to microaggressions. They also have, they have a sort of psychological makeup that makes them more prone to experiencing these things different ways, and that it actually has nothing. They're both, in other words, the perception of microaggressions and the feeling of harm, they're jointly determined by something else that you're not actually measuring. But to your question about a moratorium, I don't know. I generally don't feel like moratorium. I mean, I guess I could be persuaded. I'm skeptical as to whether moratoriums work. I mean, besides, I do think that there are some comments that people just need to, maybe you shouldn't call them microaggressions, but, I think that, saying, you're smart for a whatever, I'll just go back to that example. Yeah, if you want to call it a microaggression, fine. I think whatever, you want to call it cringe inducing, also fine. So I don't know I guess I'm skeptical of any moratorium.
Yeah, he did make the point that you identified, namely he thought that there were going to be certain personalities who were more inclined to receive a particular statement as microaggression, but then he also went on to say that given the ambiguities, there ought to be a moratorium on any diversity training programs that rely on the concept of microaggression. So there are a couple of claims that were made there. Helen, did you have a view of this?
I think that there's something here that we haven't actually addressed yet, and that is to what extent do we expect people to have a certain amount of cultural sensitivity and knowledge? So, I mean, the concept of microaggressions was developed really by Derald Wing Sue, and he uses an example of when he and an African-American colleague were asked to move to the back of a plane to balance it out. Now, the white air hostess said that this was absolutely nothing to do with their race, and it probably wasn't. But it was still a microaggression because she, as a white woman, hadn't considered what it might feel like for an African-American man to be asked to go and sit at the back. She didn't have that historical awareness. Now, some people might say that was oversensitive, and the majority of African Americans wouldn't immediately be transported back to Jim Crow and Rosa Parks and that whole situation if they were asked to balance out an airplane. But there is also a sensible level here, and I think there's a discussion to be had about that. So I think, for example, it would be implausible for any American citizen to claim not to know that the N-word was likely to cause offence and hurt, for example. But when an American I was speaking to was unaware that there is a cultural difference between abbreviating British to Brit and abbreviating Pakistani to Paki in the UK, and that Paki is actually used as a slur and it has gained those connotations by the way it has been used. This can't be explained rationally. It just has gained those connotations. This was cultural knowledge he did not have. So there's an element there where he should not be blamed for not automatically knowing this, but it can be usefully and helpfully and politely pointed out to him that he shouldn't use that word. You can abbreviate Brit, but you shouldn't abbreviate Pakistani.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Edmund, can I add one thing to my? I do think so. In terms of what Scott Lilienfeld had said, the moratorium on using the term in DEI training specifically, I guess I would be more open to that. Or maybe not a moratorium in a legal sense, but sort of if, in my own work, developing, alternative DEI trainings, I leave them out. And so I do think within that, not like, let's ban the word kind of thing, but in terms of let's do this without this concept, I think there's maybe something there. So.
Well, we have about 8 minutes or so left, and I would like to end with a couple of questions to each of you in particular. And the first one is for Ilana. You say at the end of the book that viewpoint diversity, as important as it is from your point of view, shouldn't be mandated. And so that surprised me just a little bit. In a way, it doesn't surprise because mandate sounds like an infringement on freedom of thought and all that sort of thing. And so I can see how you would want to pull back from that. But as a matter of consistency, would you also then say that we need to remove mandates for other forms of diversity having to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like?
I guess it depends on what you mean. Do you want to say what other kinds of mandates are you talking about? Can you say more?
Oh, I don't know what used to be called affirmative action. Mm-hmm. Do you think as a matter of consistency, if you're removing mandates for promoting a certain kind of diversity, should we remove it for other kinds?
Well, that sort of touches on so I can answer sort of why I think viewpoint diversity shouldn't be mandated, but the affirmative action, now you're talking, there's even I'm not a legal scholar, but in a legal framework, there are protected, viewpoint diversity is not a protected class. So when you get into the conversation about affirmative action, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but, you're talking about protected classes. And so within that framework, it seems like a different question. I absolutely think that we should be having a more complete and full conversation about affirmative action in terms of the costs and benefits and what it's supposed to be doing and whether it's working and what the unintended consequences are. So in that respect, yes, I think that in terms of the conversation, I think that with respect to viewpoint diversity and not having it be mandated, I guess, I would come at this more from a perspective of mandating it creates resentment, and it pisses people off. And so I guess to the extent that you can get traction by saying, you can either appeal to some sort of moral imperative, and that may or may not work, but even something very much like, let's think about how we're about solving problems, right? Let's talk about solving problems that people care about, take inequality as an example. And is this sort of narrow framework in which we talk about these things now, are we likely to move the needle on the problems that we actually care about? To me, you are more likely to get buy-in and get people on board than a top-down sort of compulsory motion. So that's sort of why I've landed where I have on that topic.
That makes sense. So on pragmatic or in some larger sense political grounds, you want to do the smart thing rather than the thing that's going to inflame. And in retrospect, I think my example of affirmative action was not a good one. I suppose a better example would have been something like making sure in a history of lit course you have various groups represented. That would be closer to mandating a larger intellectual diversity in a larger sense.
But I think that's a downstream problem. I think, and sorry, I'll stop, but I think that's a downstream problem. I think you're solving the problem in terms of mandating a curriculum or a syllabus or whatever, or a reading list. You're solving a downstream problem. And I understand the impulse to want to do that, but I think you're much better off. I mean, at least the space that I try and work in is upstream, sort of at the source of the river.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Helen, as we've said, you identify yourself as a secular humanist. And I'm just wondering what that means for your full theory of intellectual diversity. And that is to say, in a liberal arts college or in a university, do you think that the study of religion, and even more specifically than that, theology in some large sense, has a place in the academy? In light of your commitment as secular humanist, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but just how do you understand the relationship between the kind of freedom that you want to advance, protect in the academy, and the study of religion, including theological study, whether God exists, reasons for it, reason against, the nature of God, his relationship to the world, those sorts of questions?
Well, my postgraduate study was of theology, and I did look at religion specifically, and that's what I studied. So obviously, I'm very interested in ideologies generally, and religion is one. So I wanted to study it. But if you're asking, do I think all ideas should be able to be studied, I'd have to say I think they should, but that doesn't mean I think they have worth. I don't think that there's much worth in a lot of the critical social justice ideas. I don't think there's much of worth in a lot of religious texts, but I think that we have to be able to discuss that. I think people have to, if somebody says that God exists and wants something for the whole of humanity, then I think that person has the right to be wrong, and they have the right to be wrong in an academic setting, and other people have the right to argue for why they are wrong. And I think that that's the only way we can actually overcome bad ideas. So we do still have theology being studied. We do still have a lot of strange ideas being studied, but we've got rid of some. So there are no longer courses on alchemy or phrenology, for example. And I'm hoping that that critical social justice will die a natural death if it can be submitted to the marketplace of ideas. I don't think religion will as such. I think that that's always going to hold more meaning for people, and there are always going to be departments that are going to be, that I would find silly and foolish and coming down to angels dancing on heads of needles or whatever. But I think they have to have the right to exist. I'd be very wary of anybody trying to ban them from existing.
Thank you. We've come now to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with Helen Pluckrose and Ilana Redstone. And thanks so much to you, Helen and Ilana, for being with us and for sharing with us your views on freedom, open inquiry, and the Academy.
Thank you so much.
This is our final event of the academic year and concludes our spring public events series on diversity, freedom, and community. The theme of our fall 2021 public event series will be Capitalism, Freedom, and Community. For more information about the Institute for Freedom and Community and future events, and to view our archive of video recordings of past events, please visit our website at institute.stolaf.edu. That's institute.stolaf.edu, where you can also sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Twitter under the handle @StolafIFC. We hope you can join us again, but for now, good night, be safe, and be well.